Because breath work, like exercise mechanics, always comes from something. No one starts considering their breath until something makes them realize it.
I'd had my first concussion and taken to hospital. I'd had an MRI scan which showed a scar on my brain.
If the breath is a reflection of the nervous system, people would go, well, why don't I try and deal with the stress? And then my breathing system will correct itself.
Just because it's automatic doesn't mean it's optimal. When you start doing hard exercise, what does your body want you to do?
Because a lot of the people listening to this are probably going to be people going, yeah, well, I'm not going to do that breathing stuff like most clients do. But if they know how it could affect their shoulder press and their squats and their deadlift, it might be the thing that hits home.
Working on your tolerance of CO2 can really help you access more available time to work on your mechanics. Take anyone that's never worked on their breathing and give me 5 minutes with them. I'll get their ribcage moving further than it was before.
So over the last sort of few years, I have immersed myself in a lot of the breathing topics, mainly through issues with sort of my terrible mobility. But you have become one of the biggest sources of inspiration for this on my social media feed, and your content really dives in deep. But before we sort of like go into how we can improve breath work with people, I wanted to talk a little about your story, because breath work, like exercise mechanics, always comes from something. No one starts considering their breath until something makes them realize it. So like take us back to August 2013, if I'm right, and what led you to stop playing rugby.
You've been doing your research, fair play. And I was wondering then when you said the type of being inspired because or you've maybe seen me in the past so tight that then the fact that I can still move now, but was going to be the inspiration. But no, August 2013 was the day I can't remember the actual date. Had a brain injury that ended my professional rugby career. It was a standalone event, but it wasn't a standalone event, if that makes sense. I'd had my first concussion and taken to hospital and observed overnight because of the sort of severity of it from when I was 16. And back in 2013, when I had to retire, I was 31. So I'd had 15 years of playing professional rugby where I'd had a series of concussions throughout, and it was taking less to knock me out, and my symptoms were more severe. So a smaller impact making taking longer to recover from, and the symptoms being more severe, which led to a seizure on the training field from a completely innocuous bumping together of two of us that were friends. It wasn't a game, it was the warm up for training. We were playing touch, so we weren't even playing contact. No one was trying to hit each other hard or anything. And apparently one of my mates that was there at the time said, is actually the way you two were we were trying to catch the same ball, like we're on the same team. It wasn't even the opposition. And so just collided together. He was a lot bigger than me, so his like shoulder hit me on the jaw. And he said, you went down like a sack of spuds. And he said, we're actually about to start laughing like it was just funny. But then when I hit the deck, I then started having a seizure, having a fit. And like the closest guys put me in the recovery position and sort of called the physio over. And that was the start of a long period initially for maybe 4 or 5 months trying to get back to playing rugby, which was never going to happen. And I wish I'd made that call earlier. But in the end, the decision got made for me by the specialist, the neurosurgeon, around the Christmas time, and it was about a year-long process to become sort of fully, I'll say, classically symptom-free, rather than actually fully better, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
absolutely. But it goes into my story as to why breathing then became a bit of a thing for me.
It's a scary thing, because you were a fullback, right? Which is what I played for most of my career, and I always think I'm sure every position says this, but I think it's the most nerve-wracking position on the field, because when that high ball goes up, you're like, look up, look up, look up, look up, look down, you're immediately hit. Like, you don't know what's running towards you until you look down after catching a ball. But you just, like, despite it being a contact sport, you just assume this stuff is never going to happen to you. Like, what was that moment like when you were told that okay, you shouldn't play again, especially because you were at the club at Nottingham for the entirety of your life, so it must have been a big part of your identity, I suppose.
Yeah, there's that. Like, look. So one of the classic symptoms of concussion is like depression. And when you've been in a very dark place for a number of months, and not and think, having to retire from the sport you love, and also, rugby at that time, we were paid full time, but it wasn't like you were paid a lot of money, like, to be able to just not be worried about paying your bills. That, like, literally, it was like, it's Christmas, and how am I going to pay the mortgage? So that in itself is challenging mentally too. And the biggest thing for me was relief, because I was actually scared that I would go back I would get to a point where I'd go back onto the field, and I knew deep down that was unsafe for me, but I wasn't strong-willed enough to be able to say, look, I know something's not right. I know that none of, like, I know that the scans and the blah 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 is saying that I should be okay, but I was like, I know that I'm not okay. Like, I know that. Yeah. So the reason, finally, I'd had an MRI scan which showed a scar on my brain from the seizure that I'd had. And that was, for the neurologist, that was the no-no of playing contact sports anymore. So she was really worried about telling me that I needed to retire. And I took a massive, probably a big, deep sigh, not a deep breath, probably a terrible mouth breath, but a sigh of relief. And we can talk about why that would be a bad mechanically and biochemically poor breath. But I'd have took a sigh of relief to be like, okay, like, this is over, but what's next? And just focus on my recovery, my brain health, and what am I going to do with my career now? Or what's the new career going to be?
I suppose it's in, like, with the beauty of hindsight. It's a very smart decision, almost knowing that something wasn't okay. We see the horrendous, and unfortunate issues that Steve Thompson is going through now from keeping going and getting more head injuries and things like this. And just on the concussion thing, before we dive into the breathwork stuff, like, because a lot's changed since 2013 as regards to head injuries and concussion protocols. Like, where do you think that is in terms of rugby? Because I've always wanted to ask someone who's gone through this, because I've always gone like, well, where's this line between you sign up and it's a contact sport? Like, you wouldn't take punching out of boxing. And the more and more we kind of move into some of these protocols, the more we take away from the contact element of the game. But I'm not against ever keeping anyone safe. From someone that's sort of lived that experience and knows a lot more about it, are we doing enough in rugby today to manage concussions?
Look, I think that I can understand where different people's points of view on it. And there's that element that, like you say, it's a contact sport and we sign up for it. But I can make it super clear for you. We didn't sign up for getting knocked out, telling the physio that you were knocked out, and the physio at halftime trying to make you sick because you were complaining and feeling nauseous, which is a classic symptom of concussion. I couldn't remember any of the game, and then going back out, and then going back out onto the field, and then getting knocked out a second time. And second impact syndrome is a dangerous place to go, where you can die. And I had a triple fracture of my eye socket and jaw. Got taken to hospital to have my jaw reset and a plate put in, which I, in the end, thankfully didn't have to have put in, because I'd have not been able to have an MRI scan if that had been the case. And because I had a physical injury, my 2 concussions, those 2 won't even be on my record. And that was 5 years before I had my seizure. And that's one scenario that isn't like a big picture thing. But what I'm saying is that, yeah, I signed up to play rugby, but what we know, like what we know about brain injuries now, and what we knew about brain injuries back then, was that I should not have gone back out onto that field. 100%. And we've done a lot since then. When I literally, back in 2013, we were still laughing a bit about people not being able to remember things when you're concussed.
Yeah.
I was the first person that I know of in any of my experiences, and anyone that I was playing with at the time, they'd never seen someone have a seizure before. And I was the one having a seizure, so I've still never seen someone have a seizure before. That made it clearly very different and very like, okay, this is a bit different. This is serious. We've come a long way since then, but I still watch rugby regularly, and I work with a load of rugby players, and I watch rugby, and I watch millions of people watch someone get concussed or dazed or whatever you want to describe it as. And the law changes. If there's a suspicion of concussion, they come off. And they don't always. And there's supposed to be an independent doctor watching, looking. All you've got to do is look out for those things. We're like, well, a million of us have seen it. Why is that guy still on the field? And so there's a long way still to go. But and there's this real challenge of how do we not lose the physical nature of the game whilst keeping players safe. And I think that the players saying the players' safety is the most important thing is very different to making it the most important thing. It's very easy to say it, and that's currently where we're at. And yeah, there's probably a whole host of things that have gone on over the last. I found research related, like how concussions affect breathing, that from the 1960s. Like, we've known a lot about concussions for over 50 years, but we haven't been applying it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's, and we're still not applying what we know now. The return to play protocols based on symptoms is not adequate. But unfortunately, that's currently where we're at. And there's, little old me just searching on Google Scholars found loads of stuff around how HRV, MRI scans, breathing measurements give better indicators of like the brain's recovery rather than symptom recovery. Like the symptoms subsiding, that's great. Like that's the first step, but it doesn't mean the brain and blood flow to the brain is in a place where it's ready to take another impact. Because the problem that we're getting is someone like me has the brain has had additional impacts before it's recovered, and it's therefore had this cumulative effect. No different. It's just harder to measure, but no different. So if someone's done their ACL injury, you're most likely to have an ACL injury if you've had one before, or a hamstring tear. So, and when are you most likely to pull your hamstring again? Just when you haven't rehabbed it properly, haven't given it enough time, haven't actually done the strength of it. So it's no different to any other type of injury. We have to give it the chance to recover. The problem is that we're using the metric of symptoms to decide whether a brain is recovered or not, and that symptoms is good, but it's not indicative of whether like blood flow has restored to the brain and whether the nervous system has calmed back down.
So you sort of alluded there, certainly from a concussion standpoint, how like the breath has an impact.
Yeah, sorry, you sort of I wasn't. You sort of like basically it triggered me a little bit of like. Yeah, like I wanted to play a contact sport, but I didn't sign up for a brain injury.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
no.
And people will go, some people will still be like, well, yeah, but you knew that was going to, like, you don't know that's going to happen. And actually, yeah, anyway, I think I made it reasonably clear.
Happen. And even if you could make the argument of, yes, you sign up for a contact sport and risks happen, that doesn't excuse the fact that people have known about the concussion studies since the 60s, but are not applying them, or people are allowing it to get back on the field, or allowing it to be comical.
Classic example is like a great question I get asked now is like, would you play rugby again if you had your time? And I'd say yes, but with this information. 3 concussions. So this research shows after 3 concussions, severe cognitive decline starts to occur in the future. So you ask me, how many did I have? More than 10, easily. So if I'd have known this, you go, okay, after you've had 1 concussion, one thing I'd make sure is I'm not just measuring symptoms as to whether I'm back or not. I'll be checking my breathing, HRV, and getting a scan if I can. Once I've had a second one, I'm going, okay, 3 is my limit. So I'm starting to be real careful, with how I approach my recovery and brain health and everything. And once I've had my third one, then I might be thinking it's time to call it a day. Yeah. It's being sensible about the information that we've got now, but we're not using it at the moment. Most players do not know that. A lot of the medical staff won't even know that. Yeah. But it's there. This isn't something I've created. This is a study. I can't remember the author and the journal off the top of my head at the moment, but yeah, it's right there in black and white.
So how did you find this? How did you find there was a link between breathing and impacting your recovery if a lot of the medical teams don't know this?
You're going to potentially get into I'm not a conspiracy guy, but pharma controls a lot of the medical world, and you can't make a pill related to breathing. So it's not something that's really on the radar. But there's a lot of research into concussion, into brain injuries, traumatic brain injuries, particular, and of how the nervous system is impacted, how the respiratory dynamics are impacted. And I was probably 3 years or so after my injury, so maybe 2016, 17, something like that. Me and my wife were just looking at any things that we can do to help with brain health, knowing that I am in a category of people that are likely to develop some sort of cognitive dementia type of issues. I have some short-term memory issues that we manage, but yeah, it's something that we're obviously interested in. Brain health is important, and there was some stuff to do with gut health and the brain, and then we'd come across so we're looking at dietary things and gut microbiome, and then also looking at seeing there was some research that stated that if you had a traumatic brain injury, you're 99.9%, it was something as close to 100 as we can get, likely to have a change in your respiratory dynamics or the way that you breathe. And so I just sort of dug into that, trained with the Oxford Advantage. Patrick McKeown's the best guy in the world for this. And then I've done a lot of my own research into this, and so there's probably stuff earlier as well. But I'd found a study from the 60s that showed that after a brain injury, and it makes sense, the respiratory centers that control your breathing are in your brainstem. So when the brain's been shook up inside that skull, that respiratory rate is negatively affected as it increases. That's part of a stress response. The end-tidal CO2, so your sensitivity to carbon dioxide becomes diminished. You become more sensitive to carbon dioxide, and the mechanics, unsurprisingly, if you're going to be sensitive to CO2 and you're breathing at a faster rate, the mechanics become more upper chest, more dysfunctional. They become shallower, and again, it's all sort of linked into that stress cycle, and you've had a traumatic event, and the nervous system is impacted by that, and the nervous system and breathing are linked. Breathing is a reflection of the nervous system, and those things all impact blood flow and oxygen supply to the brain. And it's difficult for, once we've had a change in those respiratory centers, for them to sort of normalize themselves and to go back on their own. It's they need retraining. The same way if I get a physical injury and I get weaker, my hamstring gets weak because I tore it and I wasn't able to do whatever, it doesn't just get back to the strength it was at before. I've got to do some retraining of it. And it might not be as hard to rebuild strength to get back to where I was before. And with breathing, we're trying to get ourselves back to a place where of what's normal and what's healthy. And that's something that I believe the body knows how to do and wants to do, and it feels better when we
the
do.
scary thing about all of that, and and obviously it's very, very scary when you have direct brain injuries. But the things and the breathing mechanics that you were saying are a response from concussion protocols is same in a way as people who haven't had these injuries. These are the common breathing patterns that we all have, which can't be good for somebody's health. And you have a great quote that I hear you say quite a lot, is that just because it's automatic doesn't mean that it's optimal. So what goes wrong with people's breathing? What should people know about their breathing pattern?
Yeah, that's a great question. And look, it's interesting that I've seen some people that are 2, 3, 4, 5, even 10 years post concussion, and they've still got their symptoms. And the symptoms of concussion sort of mirror the symptoms of long-term dysfunctional breathing. And you go, it's been that long since your brain injury. How much of our brain injury, ongoing symptoms, are actually a result of the brain injury, or are they a result of like the affected breathing dynamics that's changed? And the two are essentially the same, because you're saying like the brain injury affected the breathing, but the longer term bit, it might be like the brain sort of got over that trauma, but it's still in a state where it's getting impaired blood flow and oxygen supply to the brain, because our breathing has stayed in this state of stress, which means breathing faster than you need to, and breathing potentially more air than you need to, which is very inefficient. So one of the things that I do is try to explain, try to help people with it, and then train, is like, be more efficient with our breathing. So that would be meaning breathing less. And there's only two ways that you can control the amount, or your brain can control the amount of air that you're breathing. And there are two different parts of the brain stem that have receptors that control them. And it's very simply the speed of your breathing and the size of each breath. So the amount of air I breathe in a minute is dictated by the speed of my breathing during that minute and the size of each of those breaths in that minute. And those two things multiplied together give me, we call it minute ventilation, but basically the volume of air that you're breathing. And if you're breathing more air than you need to, that's one, very inefficient in terms of your breathing. And then two, there's this role that carbon dioxide plays that's really important for things like blood flow, particularly blood flow to the brain, and oxygen delivery to all of your tissues. And in this case, we're talking about concussions with the brain. But this goes to anything. So when you're breathing more, it's not that your levels of oxygen are changed, you don't get any more in, or like the levels of oxygen within our body are very consistent. Oxygen's so important, it's there in absolute abundance. You have something like 3 trillion red blood cells, and you have a lot of oxygen molecules attached to the hemoglobin within red blood cells. And normal levels of oxygen within your blood are 95 to 99. Basically, you're almost full of all these gazillion oxygen molecules. 75% of the oxygen that you breathe in, you breathe out with the next breath. And that's because the body's already full. It knows it doesn't need it. But what is changing with our breathing every breath is the amount of CO2 in your exhalation. End-tidal CO2 is like the technical term for it, but how much CO2 is in your exhalation. And the more I breathe in total, the more CO2 I get rid of. The less I breathe, the more I keep it in. CO2 is a vasodilator, helps blood vessels dilate, helps with circulation, helps to restore that blood flow to the brain, and is the catalyst that allows oxygen to be released from red blood cells. So it helps with oxygen delivery to tissues. Now, so far the conversation has been very much about, like, from my story with the brain injury perspective, but as you rightly pointed out, anyone that's over a period of time developed some less efficient breathing patterns, which could be, we'll talk about the mechanics of it, could be mechanically, but could be in terms of the volume of air they're breathing and the rate at which we're breathing. And these things all link in and go together. Because if I'm stressed, could be a physical stress, could be a mental stress, any type of stress, there is a response from the body where I'm going to breathe a little faster. And that isn't going to, I need to do something to be able to like recreate that. So when I'm breathing faster, it's more difficult for me to breathe with good mechanics, because when you breathe faster, it's going to have to only be a little bit more shallow, and then it becomes more upper chest. And then things like the resistance the nose provides, you're breathing, which is good, but it might feel uncomfortable when you're stressed and wanting to breathe faster. So we open the big hole in the face and we breathe through the mouth, and then it just carries on and snowballing. And I think, like anything in life that we're doing not as well as we want to, if we don't know that, if we're not aware, then that's the problem. Whereas it's also the awareness, therefore, is like the start, the initiation of making that change. If I know nothing about my breathing and I'm just sat there breathing at 20 breaths per minute, sat feeling how you feel fine. Okay, how fast are you breathing? 20 breaths per minute. How do you know that? Well, we just did the little assessment. Okay, do you know when I'm running a 50-minute 10K, I'm breathing at 20 breaths per minute? And it's like, what? Sorry, say that again. I'm sat here doing nothing, thinking and feeling I'm fine because I'm dissociated from how my nervous system actually is. My body is breathing like you're running. And I'm not like some super duper runner. I've got into doing some ultra runs, but I'm not like fast and blah, blah, blah. It's just a case of like, we should be breathing much slower, like at rest. We should be breathing calm. And I said this already before, our breathing is a reflection of your nervous system. If you're breathing inefficiently, it's because the nervous system is under stress.
The argument could be here with regards to nervous system stuff. It's like that chicken and egg argument, right? Like if the breath is a reflection of the nervous system, people would go, well, why don't I try and deal with the stress and then my breathing system will correct itself? But is there instances, do you feel, where people's breathing mechanics has been the thing that influences their stress response? Because if I sat here and go, over time, I'm going to start to feel more stressed, even though nothing's happened to influence my nervous system than my breath work.
Yeah, it's bi-directional. The two, like the breathing influences the nervous system, the nervous system influences the breath. I think it's a great question, but you can sort of simplify and go, okay, you're right. If you work on your nervous system, your breathing is going to normalize. Great. So how are you going to work on your breathing? How are you going to work on your nervous system? I'll tell you how. You're going to use your breath, because your breath is literally like the remote control to the nervous system. How are you going to? I'm going to help to calm my nervous system. Well, how are you going to do that? You're just going to think your way into calming your nervous system down? No, you're going to have to work on your breathing, because breathing affects the nervous system, it affects vagal tone, and those things are what you're going to need to do to calm yourself out of that sympathetic dominance and get yourself more parasympathetic. So like slowing down of your breathing, extending of exhalations, humming is great for the vagus nerve as well. So you're right, but I'm also right. So we're both right, which is everyone's happy, in that like you need to address your nervous system, but the way you're going to address your nervous system is your breathing. You can't go and someone will try and sell you a pill for it. Someone will try and make some technology to do, but the best thing and the most impactful thing, and something that's completely free and it's always there for you to help you with your nervous system regulation, is your breathing. And when you really start to understand this, you then, with your training, and if you're a coach working with your clients, you get to help them improve their performance during their session. Because what happens to people's breathing when we train them? It gets challenged. But as coaches, like I was a personal trainer before being a strength and conditioning coach, before coming into all this breathing stuff, you don't get taught anything about breathing, apart from Valsalva maneuver to like brace before doing a heavy lift. You don't get taught anything about breathing. So I'm not able to teach my clients anything about breathing. And so, but you observe their breathing and you might try and get them to calm the breathing down or breathe a bit deeper, but we don't really, that gets quite misconstrued with people. And then also, what are we doing when we take someone in the gym, we train them, we're stressing them. They might love it. Stress doesn't mean that it's like psychologically bad, but it's a stress on the nervous system. It's a stress on the musculoskeletal system. It's a stress on the body. And so giving them the appropriate breathing tools to help with the down regulation, the recovery aspect that we can do, like that's the other side of what I teach. How do I use breathing to help performance, but how do I use breathing to help you recover from that performance? And that's again work on the nervous system.
So going into those two things, in terms of like, I think the first thing is a quick and easy question, especially whether it's a coach or whether it's someone just listening to this and thinking, oh my God, I need to pay attention to my breathing more. What are some of the easy ways for someone to say, is my breathing mechanics not functioning for me? What are some of the telltale signs? Because I know it goes everywhere from obviously thinking about how you move to also dental appearance, which is something I've battled with my entire life.
So like the classic sort of thing that gets said, right, is, are we upper chest vertical mouth breathing? And I have had it with a client, but this was an elderly patient that had was retired and had a concussion like 2 years before seeing me, but he wasn't aware, he got referred on from a doctor. But he was like sat there breathing like you could literally visually see. I'd never met him in person. We did it all on Zoom. He was mouth breathing, and he was visually, you could see the shoulders and chest moving vertically up. Most people's dysfunctional breathing or inefficient breathing, dysfunctional is not a very nice word to use, but most people's inefficient breathing or suboptimal breathing, at rest, you don't notice it. In that, like, most people look relatively calm, so not being changed. There was a study done last year that was like of nearly 2,000 individuals of the athletic population, and it showed that 91% of them were dysfunctional breathing with their mechanics. And I'm telling you, I spend my whole life now just walking around looking at people breathing. And if you're go to a cafe, go somewhere busy. When people are talking, obviously they're talking out of their mouth, but look at people when they're not speaking and they're just sat reading a book or on their phone or whatever. There's not 91% of the people, their mouth open going, most people, their mouth is closed. It's more so when they get challenged mentally or physically. And that might just be walking up a hill. I can't handle that. And that's when it comes out. But at rest, and this is why it's difficult, at rest, people don't necessarily notice it. But one of the simple things you can do is just sit and count your breathing for 30 seconds. See what number you get in half a minute, then double it for a minute for your respiratory rate. And see how close you are to 10, which would be nice and calm, compared to more than. And as a starting point, I know that's not mechanics based, but a starting point, that's going to get you, one, a little bit more in tune with your breathing, and two, give you an idea of that like reflection of pace of breathing, speed of breathing, frequency, which tends to be stress related. After that, we're going into like, okay, can you actually feel your diaphragm? And this was the thing I had when I started all this. I was like, okay, so I need to work on my breathing for my brain health. This is important. I do some of the assessments on my breathing. My rate of breathing, my CO2 sensitivity was terrible. I came out as a severe asthmatic, and I've never had an asthma in my entire life. And I was completely unaware that there was anything wrong with my breathing. I assumed I'm probably quite good at breathing. I feel all right now. My brain injury was like 4 years ago. I'm fine. I wasn't. And I was unaware of it. And in terms of mechanics of breathing, it's like, okay, so I know the diaphragm, so you got to be diaphragmatic breathing. I went to my friend Gemma, she's a physio, British athletics, very, very good physio, really into all this stuff. So I was like, sort of, look at me, look here, like, am I breathing right? Like, am I diaphragmatic? How do you know if you're diaphragmatically breathing or not? What's it supposed to feel like? And it's a very internal sensation. And so one of the things that I'll get with some very, very high level athletes, we're talking like international premiership rugby footballers, and they can't feel their diaphragm at the start. And if you can't feel your diaphragm at rest, it's going to be very hard for you to magically start using it really efficiently when your breathing's being challenged. The body will always go for the path of least resistance. The easiest thing is less resistance, more of a global body extension pattern of lifting the rib cage up when you're being challenged. And that phrase you said, just because it's automatic doesn't mean it's optimal. When you start doing hard exercise, what does your body want you to do?
You asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah. What, you want to speed up your breathing pattern? You're going to move to your breathing through your mouth. You're just trying to get in breath however you can.
But bigger than that, what does your body really want you to do?
You're looking at surviving.
And how's it going to help you to survive? What does it want you to do?
Fight or flight.
Yeah, less complicated. You do a hard workout.
Yeah.
What does your body want you to do? Does it want you to do that workout?
No.
It wants you to stop.
Okay, yeah, it makes sense.
How does your body help you to stop? If your body made your breathing, when you're being challenged physically, made your breathing really efficient so you could keep going, you're not going to stop. And your body wants to keep homeostasis. So the way to get you to stop is, this is my little theory on it. But it makes a lot of sense. So if you're going to do and want to optimize your performance and excel at sport, which your body doesn't want you to do, we need to breathe. We need to do something that's feels a little bit not intuitive, and that means keeping a handle on our respiratory rate. That's the first thing that wants to get out of control. And in order to, if we've got these two things, you've got the speed of your breathing and the size of your breath. If the speed of the breathing is getting out of control, and with that it becomes shallower, so the depth gets reduced, we want to actually work on the depth of our breath. And when I'm talking about depth, I'm talking about like volume. So not just whether you're can access from lower down, but actually the volume of air that you can breathe in, which helps you control your respiratory rate a bit better, which then helps you stay nervous system wise a little bit more level, but then is also going to help you to manage the oxygen and CO2 balance within the blood and the tissues. So that's where mechanics become really important, because if I'm only really just lifting and driving from that upper chest, I'm not filling and utilizing the whole capacity of the lungs that I have. You have the greatest percentage or density of alveoli low down within the lungs, the greatest amount of blood low down because of gravity, and just the shape of the lung. You have most of it's down there. The diaphragm drawing down and flattening out as it contracts, as you inhale, or should be, that's drawing air into that bottom portion. If we fill from the bottom up, we have the potential to, utilize all that is there. And then how well your rib cage can actually expand will affect how well your diaphragm can move and function, and how well your ribs move and how well they can expand and come back together. It's not just the expansion, but how well those ribs move will affect the space that you can create for the lungs to expand into. So it might not be that we can there's different trains of thought, but can you actually increase someone's lung capacity? It maybe not, but maybe. But what we definitely can do is, at the moment, take anyone that's never worked on their breathing and give me 5 minutes with them. I'll get their rib cage moving further than it was before, and therefore they're closer to their true capacity of what they already had, but they were just basically restricted. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes total sense. So when you start looking into optimal quote unquote breathing mechanics and how we should actually breathe, there's a lot of words thrown out, right? And a lot of people talk about belly breathing, they talk about pump handle, they talk about bucket handle. And I know for a lot of coaches, it's a very confusing topic. So when people are looking well, how do we coach or instruct, whether it's themselves or their clients, to breathe well, what are we looking for?
Yeah, really good question. First thing is, before we look at how the rib cage is expanding and the movement of the diaphragm, we're looking at the position of the rib cage. So the position of the rib cage is going to affect how well you can expand. The position of the rib cage will affect the zone of apposition, that area where the diaphragm is going to be able to move. So we want to have a look at someone's rib cage alignment, which you're going to be able to, you've sort of like two classic patterns, either projected forward and flared, or like quite kyphotic and compressed down.
And that's what people talk about when they say inhalation and exhalation strategy. Your inhalation strategy is that flared ribcage position, and then that overly compressed ribcage position is an exhalation strategy.
Yeah. And so we're wanting to get people with that like ribcage in a more neutral position. And where you position your ribcage will affect like your pelvis and the whole of your spine and your neck anyway. So it's just trying to cue people into better stacking alignment. But the position, that's really important. Length, trying to create some length through that spine, because when we're like when we're not long and tall, that can have an effect on just the ability for that rib cage to move. So, but once we've thought about like alignment and getting that rib cage in the right position, and I just do some really simple drills like where we're lying on the floor. And you lie on the floor, knees bent, feet flat, so the pelvis is a bit more neutral, and like use the surface behind your posterior ribs to be able to feel a connection with the back of your rib cage onto the floor. Works really, really, really simple, but works really, really well, and would change the mechanics of how someone's breathing. One thing that the rib cage is three-dimensional. We have the infrasternal angles that angle the two lower ribs mate with the sternum. That wants to widen as we inhale, so it's opening up and getting bigger. But you're three-dimensional, so we want to be expanding in all directions. We want this like lateral expansion of the rib cage. We want it to be coming all the way around. If it is expanding out to the sides, we should be getting some movement around the back and the front. And that gives the space for the diaphragm to descend down a couple of centimeters and flatten out as it does so. The diaphragm as a muscle has got a strange sort of shape, and there's two hemispheres, but we can think of it as just like this dome. But the attachment is through the middle down towards the spine. So the middle portion of it comes down. It's sort of coming down within its own space, and that helps it to flatten out. So it feels like we're getting this like expansion. But it is a contraction, a bit like how if you contract your bicep, it shortens, but the muscle belly itself like feels like it's getting bigger. So the rib cage expansion and the diaphragm movement, and then the reverse of that happening, is the nuts and bolts of like how that those breathing dynamics are supposed to, or those mechanics are supposed to work. The things like belly breathing tends to get people to, from the belly button, which is much lower down than where the diaphragm is, to sort of push that out one dimensionally, which is breathing low down is better than breathing from the upper chest, sort of if we simplify it. But often when people belly breathe, they can do that without really moving the rib cage, and you're not creating the optimum space for the diaphragm to function fully. So it's a step to breathing into your belly is a step towards getting better mechanics, but it shouldn't be our end goal, because it tends to be quite one dimensional and doesn't really incorporate the expansion of the rib cage.
And we're not looking for symmetry either, right? Because we've got one side of our body that's where, because of our liver and our stomach and things like this, where our diaphragm is going to be bigger, and we are not symmetrical creatures. So are we expecting the same amount of movement with someone on each side when you're trying to maybe free up some space?
I mean, now you're getting it like Postural Restoration Institute talk a lot about this, like your left lung, because of where the heart is as well, and left hemisphere, the diaphragm is slightly smaller, so you might get less activation or less movement of size that side. And like you're totally right. We're not like symmetrical. Do you look for absolute symmetry in every single movement that you do? How much asymmetry is acceptable, I think, depends on people. I'm just thinking wider of like any type of movement. I've got greater dorsiflexion in my left ankle than my right, and I can try to correct it, but there's only I don't from injuries and this, that, and like, and then
Bone spurs, all those things, right?
Yeah, and that'll have some effects of further up the chain, and everything. But I can do everything I want to do. So yeah, it's one of those things. Are you going to physically be able to detect the fact that your left diaphragm is a little bit smaller than the right? I don't see this with clients, in that it's more likely very subtle, but depending on what that person does as a sport and the different training and things that they've done, we get people that are their right side, which should be the one that's easier to move, is stuck down and all jacked up. And you're like, well, me telling them that should be easier, they don't care, and it's irrelevant. It's like, we need to free that side up.
Yes.
So yeah, I just work a little bit more on it. So you're right in that, like, we can say typically it might be the left side feels like it's harder to get going, but that's not always the case, I've found.
I think it's an important thing to go over, because so many coaches now are going to the exercise mechanics world, and I find there are two camps when it comes to people coaches learning exercise mechanics. So what I call muscle mechanics, which everyone's reverse banding and putting more bands on an exercise than a sex swing, and it's all about bodybuilding and function and individual joints. And then we've got sort of what I call movement mechanics, which is almost the Postural Restoration Institute thing, where it becomes almost physio sessions more than it actually becomes training sessions. And we've just got to skirt this middle ground. I'm like, well, who's in front of you? And yes, are you going to be slightly different one side to left? Yes, but if you've got this and then you can get this, that's the importance, rather than necessarily how symmetrical it is. It's where were you when you started and where were you where you finished. And a lot of the videos you post online are how very, very, very quick and easy breathing drills can massively improve somebody's rotation. Rotation, that's the word I'm looking for.
Okay, with the thoracic,
So, like, the question I've had for this, because this is something the reason why I got into breath work, for, this is maybe a personal question for me, is just feeling stiff everywhere. And thoracic extension was something I tried everything under the book to improve. And then I started looking at a skeleton like this guy here, and I started looking at the vertebrae and realizing that the thoracic was maybe meant to rotate a little bit more than extend, and how much the breathing impacted this. So, like, how does your breath work impact your position, not only of thoracic, but also your shoulder and your lower limbs? Because a lot of the people listening to this are probably going to be people going, yeah, well, I'm not going to do that breathing stuff like most clients do. But if they know how it can affect their shoulder press and their squat and their deadlift, it might be the thing that hits home.
I love this side of it. Very simply, like, I mean, there's stuff that's been studied around, like functional movement screens, like the FMS test, that take in, I think it was something like 87.5% more likely to pass a functional movement screen if you were a diaphragmatic breather compared to not. So it's not 100%, but basically, if you can breathe, then you can move. And why might that be the case? There's like the intra-abdominal pressure that we create that helps to stabilize that lumbar pelvic hip complex is a massive part of that. But I think that the couple of key areas for me that I always touch upon are like if you think, like, what is our back? Like, your skeleton in the background is a great example. Like, what's your back? Your back is literally your rib cage. It's like, there's anything else there. That's what it is. And you go, like, my lats, and but in terms of like the skeleton, like, it's just your ribs, and those ribs connect into your spine. And if those ribs are tight and not moving and compressed, and if you're very open at the front, you have to be compressed at the back. You can't be open at the front and flared out at the front and open at the back. It's impossible. So one of the things that we do is we'll use the breath to get ourselves breathing into the back to get those back ribs moving. And it's very simple. If I'm open at the front, that's closing the back, I just go into some spinal flexion positions. We're kneeling down on the floor typically, and get yourself into a lot of spinal flexion and try and take a big breath in, and you'll find that you're compressed at the front. So you have to get the ribs at the back to move. And it can be was talking to a friend of mine, a very good osteopath. He was talking about the importance of T4 for any movement within the body. And it's really interesting that I see this with people that, like, we free up that posterior rib cage around, in between the shoulder blades. And yes, thoracic rotation massively improves, like dramatically improves. Also, just teaching on that, like the fact that your rib cage needs to rotate for your spine to rotate. Like the two aren't separate things. So when you cue someone to rotate the entire rib cage, so if I'm going to go this way, like the ribs on one side going forward and around, the ribs on the other side going back and down, you just get more rotation anyway, because you're actually using the rib cage rather than the rib cage being a block for your spine. But yeah, freeing up those posterior ribs really help with that. But we'll see improvements in shoulder function, improves of hip function. I think some of the stuff that I find with shoulder is probably twofold. That if we've been very compressed at the back and those ribs aren't moving, and we get that rib cage to open up a little bit more at the back where that scapula is connected to it, and also we're starting to cue our mechanics and around like the starting point of the rib cage, like I mentioned. So if the rib cage is not projected forward and like flared up, where a lot of the power athletes I work with get to because of just all the posterior chain work that we do, we get the rib cage back a little bit, and we get the ability to expand the posterior ribs. That shoulder blade that's sat on the back of the rib cage has got something nicer to slide and glide on as you're working that shoulder. If you're doing a pressing movement or a pull up or something where the shoulder blade has to upwardly rotate around that rib cage, it's got a more stable platform to move upon. And as a starting position, if my rib cage is sort of like projected forward and tilted, the scapula is going to come with it. And it's any overhead movements, if it's already like following that rib cage, it's got a long way and a harder way to go to actually get to some degrees of overhead shoulder flexion. So that will often get some range, but also importantly or I find enjoyable is when I've worked on my breathing, I can do more pull-ups. Not from literally any training with pull-up, just from literally rib cage position, get it breathing into the back, get that scapula sliding and gliding on that rib cage. And then for the lower limbs, you've got two big players that interconnect with our breathing. Psoas major comes up and attaches and literally fascially connects into the diaphragm.
Yeah.
And then QL, the same, connects onto the lower rib and also influences and intersects or fascially connects in with the diaphragm. So if my rib cage is out of, is suboptimal in terms of positioning, it's straight away going to affect those tissues. But the rib cage positioning affects the diaphragm movement. Tied to my diaphragm is I'm just going to generally have tightness through my hip flexors through QL. And so some of the release work for the diaphragm, which is more exhalation work. So diaphragm contracts on inhales, but relaxes and lengthens and releases on exhalation. So some exhalation work really helps to loosen off things like QL and psoas through releasing the diaphragm. And yeah, you can get improvements through lower limb range of motion through breathing as well. Now, just to say, breathing isn't the cure-all for everything. Like some people might, but it's something that you're doing more than anything else. There's nothing else you do 20,000 odd times a day. Hopefully, So actually, even though it's a small thing, the sheer number of times you do it means it has a big impact.
On that note of the sheer volume of doing it, and you mentioned as well pull-ups, being able to do more pull-ups. How important is that strength component of it? Because while we say that, as you said earlier on, that breathing is automatic, we do 20,000 breaths a day. The thing I always sometimes have with some of the real basic breathwork stuff is that, yes, it's great and I can move more and I get more rotation, but leaving that session, I'm going to always do more bad reps than good reps. I always use the analogy of it's like trying to piss in the ocean and trying to make it yellow. Like, how do we create from this? I've got a little bit of movement now. Is strength the missing component there to go, right, now we've got some range, train in that, let the nervous system go, I'm all right here.
Yeah.
And that's how this thing starts to stick.
That's going to be look. I always believe it's one of my old rugby coaches used to say this. Nothing in isolation. He was quite good. Like say someone dropped the ball or we made some mistake. Normally the coach would be like, hammer the person that made a mistake. He would go back to the start of the play, and it might be like 7 phases earlier. He goes, look, that we didn't drop that ball, but that pass was a bit off. And you see how that person had to check their step, and then this happened, then this happened, this, and then the result was Jacko dropped the ball, and yeah, he's a twat. But there were a number of things that built up to this that led to that, as well as his poor catching. So nothing in isolation is a phrase that I do like to use from Martin Haag, my old coach. In that, yes, I totally agree with what you say there, and I always sort of suggest and recommend that. Create that range, then get stable, strong, let the nervous system feel happy there, be stable there, and if you'll know if you're doing the right things, because over the long term you might do your retest and you start with more range than you previously start. You still might be able to create a little bit more, but you're going to see some progression. I think the other thing that's important to do is just working on that rib cage alignment and those breathing mechanics, but not forgetting that the I might open up a rabbit hole here as we're about to come towards the end, but the thing that's driving your breathing in terms of the chemistry is the levels of CO2 that your body is sensitive to. And so working on your tolerance of CO2 can really help you access more available time to work on your mechanics, in that you're not rushed with your breathing. The more rushed you feel with your breathing, or the faster breathing rates that you want to breathe at just naturally, you can change by changing your chemosensitivity, and that gives you more time to breathe with better mechanics, because better mechanics are lower down, and better mechanics being lower down mean they take longer for that breath to happen. And so you need a little bit more of that capacity in terms of time, which is being driven by chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. So that's why we do some like slower breathing exercises, some breathing light from the Oxygen Advantage, breath holds from the Oxygen Advantage, all things that help with that. And final thing on strength is actually like working, once you've got good mechanics, work on strengthening those muscles, inhalation and exhalation. And we need to provide resistance for that. So that's things like using the sports mask that we use, and you can use some external load, on when you're doing some of your breathing mechanics drills. But all stuff that's really easy to do, like part of a warm up, if you like.
Is like so with that, because we could, as you're quite right, we could go down a wormhole and see that be maybe save for a part 2 or another thing down the line, but without going down that wormhole too much, I suppose that's then looking at like, well, okay, if we can get ourselves on the floor drills or these rounded back drills where we can start looking, okay, let's get the rib cage to move and let's get this posterior expansion. I suppose then bringing it together with what you said at the start of, well, how do you assess if someone's breathing mechanics is good? You challenge them. It's then, well, what are the positions you want to be in? Can we get you now using the breathing from the floor into those positions? Like sit at the bottom of a squat with a pause with more load. Not obviously a 1 rep max, but learning to breathe in a deep squat, learning to breathe in an overhead position, learning to breathe in a hang, which if you want to shut off everything that might help you out, that'll do that, right? And just slowly getting yourself like, okay, can I breathe in this position? Can I breathe at altitude? Can I breathe down here? Can I breathe on the floor? Can I breathe on a carry?
Give yourself variation and capacity. We'll often learn some mechanics initially on the floor, because when you're on the floor, the diaphragm doesn't have to do any stabilization work. It can just do breathing work. So we don't forget that it's a part of the deep core stabilizer. So you put yourself on the floor, completely supported. It just gives you a easier access to feeling the diaphragm as a breathing muscle. But yeah, no, totally with you on that. Like we're doing our clients a disservice if we teach them how to breathe on the floor, but that's not going to translate into when they have to move and stabilize and think and get challenged. And I think for me, best bit of advice for clients is like, for coaches working with clients is like doing something like that thoracic rotation, for example, lets them get some buy-in of going like, freaking hell, we've spent 2 years trying to get my thoracic to move, and you've done 2 minutes with me on breathing, and now look at me. It's like, yeah, do you want to know anything else about breathing that I've got for you? Do you know what I mean? That's tend to give them some sort of, breathing isn't sexy, but giving someone a shed load of rotation through their thoracic, if that's what they're into, like, they're going to love that, and then they'll be interested in what else. And even just like, and me and Andrew Tracy have done a bit of work together where, you know, we sing from a similar hymn sheet of like just being a bit more aware of your breathing and just realizing that it is a reflection of the nervous system. It is something that can help you with your training, and even if someone just thinks about their breathing when they're trying to recover, they'll probably breathe a bit better. That's it. Like, it can be as simple as, you know, we can go down and be more specific, but as a starting point, awareness is super useful, and anyone can coach awareness. You just say, let's be a bit more heavy breathing. When you've blown out of your ass, like, try and slow it down a bit.
I totally agree with that in so many ways, and it's like that buy-in is incredible. Whether people don't really want to do the breath work if you don't explain it, and for me it was like, I've been working for years on trying to get a thoracic extension, and then I looked at my posture, and then I looked at the skeleton, and I went, there's not much room for extension between those thoracic vertebrae compared to the lumbar. Maybe I'll try and work on rotation. And I was like, oh. And then I did some stuff for that. I'm like, oh, this can improve. So for me, that was a light bulb moment. I've been focusing a little bit on the wrong thing. And for clients, it could be, well, how do we make this feel like an ab exercise? So we can put it in at the end of your workouts. It's an ab drill, but like, you know, but that's not, you are getting that.
Look, get them in a dead bug.
Yeah.
Teach them some breathing mechanics on the floor. Then get them to lift their knees up from that bent knee position. Get them breathing with their feet off the floor. Go to like the half of a dead bug, and get them to breathe 5 in, 5 out, and actually feel the diaphragm and rib cage moving. Feel the lower back connected to the floor still, and they'll be shaking like a shitting dog. Like, it's hard to breathe and stabilize, and because what most people do is we hold our breath and globally brace to stabilize. We haven't been taught, and we don't have the capacity or ability to actually breathe and stabilize. We can do very hard core exercises, but if you ask them to, okay, do that same exercise, but don't hold your breath. This time, breathe in and out through your nose. Try and get your sort of rib cage to expand. Feel your diaphragm. Then tell me what that feels like. And it's a different kettle of fish. So yeah, for sure, you can make it. I'm with you on that. It's got to be integrated. That's a word I use all the time with my professional athletes. It's got to be integrated into their training, and it definitely can't be boring. No one's going to do it if it's boring. And ultimately, it's got to impact. They've got to feel a change, feel a difference, and then they're going to want to do it.
And same thing with the awareness strategies as well, right? It's like me putting nasal strips on. Nasal strips will open up nasal passage, and we can make things easier for nasal breathing. But it is also just something that's stuck on your nose that reminds you, breathe through this. Yeah. And that's probably doing as much of the work than the strip itself actually is. It's just that awareness of...
Yeah, I don't think the strip does... It does a little bit. It doesn't do that much. A nasal dilator really like opens it up. But and I've done the same thing. I've used the strips. If you put a strip on your nose and go out for a run, at any point during that run, if you run past someone and you're panting for your mouth, you look like a right idiot, because you're like, why have you put that on your nose? You're just going to use your mouth. So like, it forces you to like, you're like, I look a little bit like an idiot because I've got this thing on my nose. At least I'm going to keep my mouth closed so I don't look like more of an idiot.
Yeah. So there's a question I always finish with before we find out where to find you. And I ask this because I think it's so easy to look at people who have achieved whatever you consider success in a various field and think that we're so far away from them, and think that we can't be wrong, we've got to be perfect. And obviously you started this after a rugby career, so the knowledge you have on this topic is amazing considering when you started and where you are now. But give me one thing you have changed your mind on.
One thing I've changed my mind on. Quitting or giving up.
Interesting.
Well, I used to always think, and it served me very well, and it still will serve very well for lots of things. Like I was it last year? 2022. Yeah, last year did a 3-day ultra marathon, 216 kilometers around Anglesey. which is just down there, the island off of Wales. I thought I was literally going to die on the morning of day 3, and I couldn't get out of bed, let alone move and blah, blah. And I didn't quit, and made it to the end. Came third last. Very happy with that, because it was like a survival thing, yes, which the ultras tend to be. And I didn't quit, and all of that not quitting served well for that. When I was going through my brain injury, the not quitting, the not giving up, because I knew it just wasn't right. There's times when the thing you're doing isn't right, and you go, look, this isn't right. I'm going to stop going that way, and I'm going to go this way. I made it more painful for me and my wife to go through everything we were going through during that period by still trying to carry on. And I used to think that quitting was a very negative thing, whereas now I think I'm searching for, like, make the right decision, and quitting might be the right decision, but it typically has quite a negative connotation with it. So that's definitely something I love that.
I love that. And I think that's something for me. And even on smaller things, I'm just like picking up hobbies, doing things with, like, they might serve you one time, they might not serve you the other. They might be thinking it just takes that nervous system over the edge. So I absolutely love that.
Well, the classic one apparently is, if you like trying to get somewhere on Google Maps or whatever, and you're driving your car and you take the wrong turning, our bias is, rather than just turning around and retracking your steps back to where you need to then go, is that we're more likely to try and continue where we're going and turn it into the right route, even though it's going to take longer, because we hate turning around and going back the way we came, apparently. And you can imagine that you'll catch yourself doing it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So for people who want to find out more about you and what you do, and tell us about where to find you, but also any upcoming events, especially in the UK, because I think you've sold me, and I will definitely come and attend one of them. So give us a little bit of
can you find me? You can find me somewhere in North Wales. This is where we've moved to. So if you are in Snowdonia, you may see us running around. But yeah, no, we've moved home to North Wales, and we're very excited about being. I can see Anglesey and the sea down there, and cool. Snowdonia Mountain Ranges is behind us. But do workshops and things all over the place. So got a workshop on the 3rd of December in Manchester. Got a workshop on the 9th of December in Cardiff. Don't know when you're putting this out, if they're done by then. And that's the last thing of this year. And then next year, 9th to 11th of February, doing the Oxford Advantage certification. So you become a certified with the Advanced Oxford Advantage instructor. That's in Nottingham. I'm also doing it as like a retreat style in May in Scotland.
That's
and
cool.
Then we've got 2 trips to Tenerife, one in March and one in November next year. That's what's in the diary so far. And I'm sure there'll be more. And
where can people find out about those if they want to join?
On the internet.
Yeah,
so my website's probreathwork.com.
Yeah.
Instagram, jacko.david.jackson. I'm sure you'll be kind enough to put some links in the show notes.
Absolutely will. I absolutely
people
will.
Can just drop me a DM if you want, if you like. You said something about something in Manchester. What's the link? And I'll just drop me a DM and I'll send you.
Brilliant, man. This has been an absolute pleasure. Really, really enjoyed this. Thank you for your time.
No worries. Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.